Really theological standpoint. And next week, we're going to go back to verses 13 through 15, and I'm going to propose some ways in which this event, that is the stopping of the sun, the stopping of the moon, could have occurred. So we're going into astronomy, quantum physics, quantum mechanics, planetary motion, my favorites next week. But this week, you're spared, okay? All right.
Did we talk about that earlier in another?
No, I haven't yet.
Okay.
It's different. So, verses 1 through 5, let's read. Now, it came about when, It came about when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai, and had utterly defeated it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, that he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, because it was greater than Ai, and all of its men were mighty. Therefore Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem sent word to Hoam, king of Hebron, and to Piram, king of Jarmuth, and to Japhia, king of Lachish, and to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel. So the 5 kings of the Amorites, king of Jerusalem, king of Hebron, king of Jarmuth, king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, and they with all their armies encamped by Gibeon and fought against it. Okay. Well, let's go kind of tear this apart. So we see that the 5 kings of this Hivite coalition decide that they're going to attack the Gibeonite towns that we identified last week. Because, of course, they realized that the Gibeonites had betrayed them by making a pact with Israel. The apparent ringleader of this coalition is this guy, Adoni-Zedek. His name is very interesting. It means Lord of Righteousness or Lord of Justice. Now, there's another Lord of Righteousness that has occurred earlier in the Bible. You find him in Genesis 14:18, and his name was Melchizedek. He was called Melchizedek, the Lord of justice, of righteousness, the king of Shalom, Salem. Now, I think that this guy, Adoni-Zedek, is obviously a pseudo-king of righteousness. He is the satanic antitype, or he is the imposter of the Lord. Okay?
And there's a lot of those.
There's a lot of them. Yes. So these kings see what Israel had done to Jericho and Ai, and they don't want the same future for themselves. Now, it's interesting what is said about Gibeon here. Gibeon, obviously, according to verse 2, here, where it talks about being a royal city, it obviously was a key part of this alliance. The word royal city in Hebrew is Mamkaka, and it means a place of dominion, or a king's special place, or an estate, or a place of, or a seat of power. So there was something unique about Gibeon to the rest of this coalition group. Further, it makes a very interesting statement. It says that its men were mighty. The word there in Hebrew is the word Gebor. In other words, is indicating to us that there was apparently some amount of genetic material from the Giborim that were in some of these people, and that's why they were called, quote, mighty hunters. This same word, interestingly enough, is used in multiple places in the Old Testament, but one place it's used that I think is very interesting, because I was digging at this, is it's used to describe Alexander the Great. He calls him a Gibor. Interesting? All right. So, what we see here is here is an extremely important strategic city with extremely experienced warriors, probably of great size, and they've defected from the coalition. I think it explains why it is that they decided to attack Gibeon rather than attack Israel. You would think their real enemy would be Israel, and Gibeon would be secondary. But I think there is such an importance here on Gibeon, and on top of that, I think that they don't want another betrayal. They don't want another city to make peace with Israel again and further compromise their coalition. So they go after Gibeon. Now, it's interesting, if you dig a little bit at history, I was looking at the city of Lachish, because you know me, I like to nerd around.
And where would that be?
Well, this map, unfortunately, doesn't go very far west.
It's over in there.
It's over here. It's just west of Gibeon.
Isn't it near Gaza?
It may be.
Over that direction?
Yeah, that, unfortunately, that's the best map I have right now, and that I can get a better one. But so what I found is that Lachish is a city that was attacked by Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. Sennacherib was a mean guy. The Assyrians were vicious. They were the ones that gave us impaling, you know, okay? You know, they would take their prisoners and they would impale them from the bottom to the top on wooden stakes as they left the town to give a message, you really don't want to oppose us again, all right? They had extremely sophisticated warfare. They had extremely sophisticated technology, you know, siege ramps and ramming equipment and things like this. But they came, I think in the 9th century, against Lachish, the city Lachish that we're talking about in the coalition. He laid siege to it for months and months, couldn't succeed at it, and left. So Lachish is not small potatoes, okay? It's obviously a very powerful city in and of itself. So as I said, possibly fearing another betrayal to this coalition, Adonai-Zetek organizes an attack on Gibeon as a first order of business and not an attack on Israel right away. It says in the verse here, I think it's in verse 5, it says they camped against it. In other words, the idea is they set up supplies and ramps and started a siege process. That's what it means. They camped against it. All right? So let's read 6 through 10, verses 6 through 10. Then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, saying, do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. And the Lord confounded them before Israel, and he slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. All right? So, let's go through this. Despite the fact that the Gibeonites clearly had great warfare capacities with valiant warriors, despite these military abilities, they apply in faith to Israel. Notice what the Gibeonites didn't do. They didn't turn their back on the oath that they made with Israel. They didn't try to patch things up with the former alliance. They did not trust in their own power, nor did they respond with hopelessness, but rather, interestingly enough, they responded in faith. And this should be extremely instructive to us spiritually as a type. Let's turn to a couple passages and look as examples. Turn, why don't you go, since we're already in the Old Testament, why don't you go to Psalm 46 first, since we'll just go to the right here. Psalm 46. And let's read some things here. Verses 1 through 3. It starts out in verse 1, God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. And the Gibeonites sure said they needed help presently, because they were in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride. So here's the confidence that we need to have in depending on the Lord.
Люда, это 45-й в русской Библии. Псалом 45, первого Движка идет. I'm sorry. The number of psalms in Russian and
is off
the
one.
Bible,
Yeah.
they're off one.
Okay, now go to your right further to the book of Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah 40. And we're going to start at verse 28.
Исайя 40. Исайя 40.
Isaiah 40, starting 28. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. He gives strength to the weary, and to him who lacks might, he increases power. Though youths grow weary and tired, and vigorous men, young men, stumble badly, yet those who wait on the Lord will gain new strength. And then this very famous passage from Isaiah. They will mount up like with wings of eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. This is the promise that we're given when we depend on the Lord. Go into the New Testament now, further to the right, and go to the book of 2 Corinthians. And here's Paul saying a very similar thing in 2 Corinthians, the second to last chapter, 12. So 2 Corinthians 12. And it's verse 10. Paul talking about his own struggles, which were many in his apostolic work. The persecution he received. You know, he gives us actually a little bit before this here a whole list of the things that he went through. And he says, he concludes in verse 10, he says, therefore I'm well content with weaknesses and with insults and with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. In other words, until we recognize our own incapacity, we're not really motivated to really depend on the Lord. Right. As long as we think we can pull it off, right, we'll pull it off. Right. But when we get to the point where we realize this is really beyond me, then of course it motivates us to depend on the Lord and wait for Him. Finally, if you go back a little bit from 2 Corinthians to Romans 10, one last verse here. Romans chapter 10, starting verse 11. Paul starts in verse 11 with a quote again from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 28. He says, for the scripture says, whoever believes in him will not be disappointed. For there's no distinction between Jew and Greek. For the same Lord is Lord of all, abounding in riches for all who call upon him. For whoever will call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. That's the promise here that Paul tells us. So this is the position that the Gibeonites took also. And because of it, they got the protection that they sought. God honored it through Israel. Yes.
Well, the Gibeonites knew God was on Israel's side. And also Israel honored the commitment they had made
Yes.
to the Gibeonites, and God fought for them.
Yeah. Of course, we don't know about this because it didn't occur, but I have to propose to you that if somehow Israel had decided that they weren't going to honor this oath, bad things would have happened to Israel.
Right.
Because we know 400 years later, bad things happened to Israel.
Yeah,
When they
because of Saul.
Because of Saul. Saul got overly zealous and murdered some of the Gibeonites. And God says to him, no, you made an oath, and causes 3 years of famine in Israel because they did that until they made it right with the Gibeonites.
And David had to
make it right. Yes.
Isn't it interesting? I mean, the Gibeonites are the first ones that made the mistake, but yet, God still keeps working with Israel.
The thing that we should learn about the Gibeonites is they're like us.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? We're deceptive at times. We're not straightforward. Okay? We have an agenda often. We don't always act in faith. But then in some cases we do act in faith. And sometimes, you see, they really represent the reality of the struggle of the believer in many, many ways in what happens to them. Now, despite the clear mistake Israel made in entering into this treaty, interestingly, they don't hesitate to honor it because of that, the Lord tells Joshua not to fear this upcoming battle, okay? Because God says he will guarantee the outcome of the battle. Think about that. Think about God saying, you see this coalition of what undoubtedly put out there on the field of battle was tens of thousands of individuals, okay? At least that, against Israel and against Gibeon. God says, don't worry, because you're not going to lose a man. That's what he tells them. All right? Now, I'm going to read this to you. You don't have to turn here, but I'm going to read something in Hebrews chapter 6 that I think is applicable to this situation. I'm going to read chapter 6, starting verse 13. This is about Abraham. Listen to what Paul, the author, I think Paul of Hebrews says. For when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater than himself, he swore by himself. All right? He makes an oath, but he swears it by himself because there's no one greater than God. Think of in Exodus verse 3:14 when Moses says at the burning bush, "Who are you?"
I am who I am.
I am the who I am. I am the all-existent, ever-existent one. And then he says in verse 14, saying, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply you. This is God's promise to Abraham and his descendants. And thus, having patiently waited, Abraham obtained the promise. For men will tend to swear by one greater than themselves. Okay? I swear to you by the gold of the temple and all this, okay? And with them an oath given as confirmation is the end of every dispute, giving your word. In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose. Now think about what you just said there. God makes this covenant with Abraham, and God tells Abraham, you don't have any worry about this coming about because I will do everything to bring it about despite how you act. It's a one-sided agreement. That's all on God. And he says, let me read it again. In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of this promise the unchangeableness of God's purpose, he interposed by himself making an oath. In other words, he made an oath based on himself, God. In order that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we may have strong encouragement. We who have, quote, fled for refuge in laying a hold of the hope set before us. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil, that is, the veil of the temple. Who is it that symbolically entered within the veil?
The high priest.
Well, he literally did, but who eventually symbolically entered in because the veil was torn in half? Jesus and his sacrifice, okay? Where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest for us forever according to the order of this guy we just talked about, Melchizedek. So what Paul's telling you is the work of God cannot be undone. The work of salvation cannot be undone. All right? God verifies by his own person the salvation and the forgiveness of all people. Therefore, you can't lose it. It's impossible. If you lose it, then God's a liar. God didn't do it well enough. And of course, he says here it's impossible because God verifies it by his own person. So, it's a very interesting, I think, set of verses there. Now, despite getting this guarantee from God about the battle, Joshua does not hesitate to act, and almost immediately he organizes the military for a night march. He undertakes at least a 15 and probably closer to 25-mile forced march with a military group up a rugged mountain system. Think about it. He's just been guaranteed that they're going to have victory, but does he go to his tent and say, that's great, I think I'm going to have a great night's sleep, drink a few goat milk, sodas or whatever, and it'll be wonderful. No, that's not what he does. He immediately gathers his military force and says, we're marching now. And they do. Think about going on a night march for 25 miles to this mountain system. That's tough.
You're putting it mild.
Yeah, it's tough.
That is very, very mild compared to actually doing it.
Right.
And if you're going up a mountain, you could be in bad weather.
Absolutely.
And the task that they had, phenomenal.
Yeah.
I've been there.
Now,
It's
it's about fun.
Lots of rocks.
Yeah, lots of rocks. Let me read a verse that I think applies perfectly well to what we just see here and what Joshua is doing. It's James 2:17. Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead being by itself. This is the spiritual application of this. God promises, but when he calls us to act, we need to act. All right? Because he wants us involved in the process. So, Israel, the faith was converted into action. So, Israel is engaged, they engaged the Hivite coalition, taking them by surprise after a night march. Now, if you'll notice in these verses that we're going to read, you're going to see here that there are two different elements to this battle. One was the slaughter of the Hivite soldiers by the Jewish soldiers. That's one element of it. But that was a minor part of it. Mm-hmm. The second part of it was the miraculous strategy by God in the battle. So let's read it. Let's go starting in verse 11, back in Joshua, chapter 10, we're going to read 11 through 15. It came about as they fled from before Israel, that is the Hivite soldiers, while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, that the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than those who the sons of Israel killed with the sword.
I told you, stones.
Yeah.
And a lot
Now think about this, and we're going to talk about this more in a minute. Can you imagine? God prepares what I believe here in the Hebrew are meteorites, or maybe bolides, could be either one. He prepares them, he has them enter into the atmosphere, and he targets them only on Hivite soldiers. It doesn't hit one Jew. There's a miracle. That's a miracle. Verse 12, then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And Joshua said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? And the sun stopped in the middle of the day and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there was no day like that before it or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp back to Gilgal. Now, this is a passage in the Bible that is extraordinarily criticized by many scholars because it seems like it's an absolute impossibility. Now let me go through a few things here. First of all, let's talk about the multiple miracles that occur in this battle. First, he sends stones from heaven, I think meteorites or bolides, that target, as I said, only the Hivite soldiers. There's a big miracle. Number two, God responds to a request by Joshua to lengthen the daylight so to pursue the Hivites by causing them to be able to conquer it all, and he by causing the apparent motion of the sun to stop and thus extend daytime. Now there's a trick. Okay? Thirdly, in a similar way, God stops the apparent motion of the moon also. Now,
God created this, he could do it.
all right. So, let me make it. Go ahead, Jack.
How does that compare to, was it Hezekiah on the steps
Yes.
where the sun also stood
Yeah.
backwards?
Hezekiah is complaining that he doesn't think his life should be over, so he pleads to the Lord to have 15 more years. And then he wants a sign for God to prove that he's getting 15 more years. So God said, okay, look, do you see the sundial out there? I'm going to make it go backwards, okay, to show you that he got 15 more years. And by the way, if you continue to finish the story, I think you conclude that it was a big mistake for Hezekiah to want 15 more years.
Well, yeah.
It didn't go very well for him, okay? He should have just accepted the Lord's will. Now let me say this first, as we get into this subject. A miracle is a supernatural event initiated and caused by God, which causes effects which defy the natural order or normal principles of the universe. Do you want me to say it again?
Well, we have it on
Okay. Now, I'm making the statement here that if one assumes that God is the creator of the universe and that he set in motion the normal motions of planets, the sun, and the moon, it is not impossible to believe that he can suspend or interrupt those movements when and how he chooses, because he's the one that created it. Okay? Now, as I said here, the next point, most of us in the New Testament have no problem believing that Jesus healed the blind, that he made the mute speak, that he took away leprosy and other diseases, and even raised someone from the dead. Most people don't balk at that. Of course Jesus did miracles. Is this any different, or is it any harder to believe what God did here in the book of Joshua. They're still miraculous events. Okay? They're just more spectacular even than what he does here in Joshua chapter 10. Now, let's look at a few verses. Turn to the book of Job, chapter 9. Go to your right from Joshua and go just before Psalms. Job, chapter 9. Job is a very interesting book. There are many very interesting things that we learn from Job in his dialogues. Job 9, starting in verse 5. It is God who removes the mountains. They know not how. When he overturns them in his anger, who shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble? Notice verse 7. Who commands the sun not to shine, to set a seal upon the stars? Who alone stretches out the heavens and tramples down the waves of the sea? And he goes on and talks about then the Pleiades and Orion and the Big Dipper, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, he's saying, when you're talking about earthquakes, when you're talking about movement of mountains, when you're talking about events which occur in the sky, God is the one that put them all into motion, and God is the one that can choose to control them.
And how Job knew about it.
Because the Lord revealed it to him. There's a lot of interesting stuff that Job learns that we don't know how except God told it to. Turn to chapter 38 of Job. Job chapter 38 is a really fun chapter.
Yeah.
We're only going to read verse 4, but it's a chapter where after all of these dialogues where Job's buddies try to figure out why this happened to Job, okay? And they're giving all these reasons why they think this occurred to him. And finally, after all of this has gone on for probably maybe weeks of time, God shows up in a whirlwind and says to them, shut up. Literally.
Including
Don't
Job.
speak.
Right, including Job.
And then verse 38 occurs, which I find a really fascinating chapter because I call it the chapter of 77 science questions. Because if you'll count these questions, there's 77 of them. All right? And they're all about science. So here's one of them. Verse 4. I think is it 38:4? Yeah. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Okay? And it goes on and talks about all of these things. For instance, let me give you an example of just verse 12. Have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place? In other words, Job, do you understand the rotation of the earth? That it might take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked be shaken out. And he goes on, it's changed like clay under the seal. And he goes on and talks about all these elements of light. He talks about ocean currents in verse 16. He talks about the diameter of the earth in verse 18. He talks about the nature of light in verse 19. He talks about the ice-rain cycle in verse 22. He talks about electricity in verse 35. Okay? He gives them 77 science questions and basically asks them if they can answer one. And they can't. And then he concludes and says, then why do you guys ask why I did this to my servant Job? Okay? So, we see here...
And the book of Job is more ancient book than...
Probably the oldest. Probably the oldest. Now, I want to go into one scientific principle here tonight. I want to talk about the difference between uniformitarianism and catastrophism. Isn't that easy?
Oh, yeah.
Uniformitarianism is the belief that things have always been a certain way and will always continue to be that way in the future. Okay? They've been in the past, they'll be in the future, only with very minimal changes. there are many scientists.
Wait a minute, wait a
Slow
minute.
down, slow down.
Just say it again.
Things
You-
have been, well, first of
Always
all,
been that way.
The way things have been in the past, they will continue to be that way in the future. It's uniform. Okay?
okay, how you pronounce the word? Uniform.
Uniformitarianism. Yeah, there's a good one for it. Can you say that 3 times fast?
You're doing this to a professor.
Yeah, I know. I know.
Fine, you know,
got it.
girl.
All right, now,
Uniformitarianism.
yeah, very good. The other view is what we call catastrophism. And catastrophism says that the events of the earth are spiked by periodic catastrophes or cataclysms which radically change things on the earth or events on the earth in a very short period of time. Okay?
Okay,
Repeat, say that again.
Repeat and
Can-
consolidate.
You see, they all know, they already know.
Events of the earth are spiked.
By periodic catastrophes which change elements of the earth in a very rapid fashion.
Atom bomb.
Okay? Now,
Let's change what of the earth?
The elements.
elements of the earth, in other words, the mountains, the sky, whatever you want to that's part of the earth. Now,
They
part of-
change the elements of the earth
very rapidly.
very rapidly.
Let me give you an example. I'm going to give you, I'm going to try to come up with a lot of them, show you, but
The flood?
has anyone ever been to Mount St. Helens? No? Okay,
All
well,
right, go ahead.
all right. You remember what happened?
That's an excellent example.
All right, remember what happened in Mount St. Helens in 1980, 81?
Blew out.
Okay. The east side of it literally blew out.
Correct.
And it blew an enormous amount of material east. Okay. It landed in Spirit Lake, and there was so much material at Spirit Lake, it caused the water in the lake to go up the side of the hill about 300, 400 feet. There's even a watermark still that you can see. And then it came back down. It blew the forest flat. And I mean, every huge pine, ponderosa pine there, lays exactly the same way from the blast. They're all lined up like matchsticks
And burn it.
and burnt. And it covered the place with an enormous amount of volcanic soil,
Is that
pumice.
when one of your former presidents died there?
No, he wasn't a former president. It was a guy whose name was a former president. He was just an old guy who had the same name as a former president.
Although it was a former president who had a
No.
property there.
No, it wasn't. No.
What was the name?
Harry Truman. It was just a guy that happened to be called Harry Truman. And they tried to get Harry out because they knew the mountain was bulging and it was going to go. Harry, it was like 82 and he says, I've been living here my whole life and I ain't leaving here. And of course, Harry's now buried under, hundreds of feet, okay?
And that was true of Harry Truman.
Yeah, it was. It was. Very, very typical, actually. Now, here's the thing. I've been there and I've seen Mount St. Helens, so I'm using it as an example. On the east side, where the blast zone went, you had in 24 hours, okay, because of the blast, 80 feet of debris that piled up. 80 feet of it in 24 hours. That's catastrophism. You have the development of sediment in a very short period of time that if you believed uniformitarianism, you would say, well, it'd take millions of years for 80 feet like that to go. No, it didn't. Everyone knows because they were there and saw it that it was 24 hours. Okay? Now, let's talk about some examples of catastrophism. I wrote down a few of them myself. Okay? And the first one, Anne talked about, and that's Noah's flood. Do you realize that almost every culture in the world that has any written records whatsoever has their own flood story? There's over 300 cultural flood stories that have been written down all around the world. Now, you either conclude that all these people remarkably had 300 different huge floods that they all reported, or they got on the internet and talked to
They
each
have
other,
internet.
okay? All right. Or they were all reporting one flood that occurred, which is a little bit more logical to me, okay? That's right, Bill. Okay? Interestingly enough, we have geological evidence of this. There's a thing called the Cambrian die-out, and it's a layer of fossil record where you find that there's a massive amount of fossils that there weren't before. I mean, it's huge. It's a huge fossil layer, all right? Very concentrated.
They've also
Also,
found
that
like
mini-
mastodons, and I think it's in
Mini-
the Siberia, that had food
Yes.
still in their mouth.
Yeah, and that's another catastrophic event that I'm going to talk about. Very good. Now, how about massive meteorite craters? Anybody ever been to Winslow, Arizona? Big crater. Everybody ever been to the Yucatan Peninsula?
Peninsula.
Yeah, huge crater. We know, for instance, that in Siberia, I think it was 1908, I think it was, say it, the Kudus.
Tunguski meteorite.
Okay. Has anyone ever read about that meteorite? It apparently blew up a few miles above the Siberian forest in 1908. And it was an explosion that was so loud that it was heard 2,000 miles away. It blew the forest flat, okay, and made a monstrous crater there that's there to this day. All right? So that's an example of catastrophism. Now, how about the Ice Age? It's an example of catastrophism. You have the development of massive amounts of ice forming glaciers that came down and absolutely bulldozed the existing areas all the way down to, interestingly enough, where we are, virtually Ohio. Look at Northwest Ohio. It's flat as a billiard board table because we see moraines and other elements that show us that there were glaciers there. And glaciers were all over the world, okay?
And what it did was it transferred in that the finest growing soil
True.
around the
It was
world.
the greatest bulldozer that ever was built.
Great. D10, here we go. Isn't
That's
that
right.
Mikey?
How about tsunami?
Okay, we'll get there. We have evidence of tropical plant fossils in Antarctica. Think about that, which proves what point about Antarctica?
Wasn't always frozen.
It wasn't always frozen, okay? There is a very great possibility, based on geological evidence, that the inclination of the Earth was not always 23.5 degrees. There's evidence that it shifted from a more upright position, which is part of the reason why, after it shifted, we had seasons. And we had two poles that got much less energy from sunlight and created frozen areas. Okay?
So that was after the flood?
Yes. I think it was caused by the flood, because I think it created the evaporation cycle. We also have evidence in the geological record on numerous occasions of periodic north-south pole shifts. Do you realize that?
We're going through it now, really.
It looks like we may be going through it, where the poles shift, and sometimes they shift dramatically, so that north and south pole exchange. Now, you talk about shaking up the Earth.
You're shaking up the height of the ocean.
Oh, yes.
Quick.
It's a very cataclysmic event when it has occurred. How about the fact that originally scientists believed there was a supercontinent called Pangaea?
Then it divided.
Take all the continents of the world and they all fit like pieces together, if you've noticed, if you look at them. The Bible talks about Pangaea in Genesis 10. It looks like there was great tectonic movement, and they split apart, and it was the beginning of this fracturing of these plates that occurred when that. If you want another one, go out in the night sky on a clear night and go look at this thing called the moon. What do you see on the moon?
Patches.
Keep going. What do you see?
Craters.
Craters. What are craters from?
Either meteorites or something that
Right.
occurred. And,
Okay.
and if you look at the other, like Mars or any of the other countries, or not countries, but planets, even Pluto. Look at the rings around Saturn.
Now, one of the things I'm going to suggest to you, I'm kind of getting you ready for next week here, because next week's our science week. I'm going to suggest to you that the motion of the Earth and the motion of Venus and the motion of Mars were not always the way they are today, but they've changed. I'm going to try to show you the evidence of it. I'm going to at least show you. There's another thing that's interesting. You know how we've taught you, Joshua has said, the commentary in Joshua here says that it's the longest day of sunlight. Do you realize that we have historical records in China where they talk about the longest night? And it's not just China. We have a lot of cultures that write about the longest night. They happen to be on the other side of the world from the Middle East. So they got the longest night when these guys got the longest day. So I'm going to present this evidence to you and show you that there's a lot of astronomical, geological, and even cultural evidence that there was something extremely unique that happened. And I'll try to explain how I think it may have occurred. Again, I'm not telling you I know absolutely this is what I had to have occurred, but I'm showing you the evidence that's suggestive that indeed this may have been what occurred.
Should we skip quiz next week?
No, you're going to do it. No, it's the week after that'll be bad.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, yeah.
Because you're going to have to cite all the astronomical evidence.
Can I ask you
Yes.
a question concerning what you're discussing?
Yes.
Christian and non-Christian and Earth warming.
The warming of the Earth?
Global warming, you mean?
Do you want my opinion about what it is?
I already have my opinion,
Okay.
so I'd like to hear yours.
Well, my opinion is that it is the periodic cyclical warming and cooling of the Earth that if you plot sunspot cycles going back hundreds of years, you see that increase and decrease in temperature absolutely mimics the energy's output of the sun. I think it's a cyclical event which occurs, that's going to occur, and no one's going to stop it from occurring.
Who's in control?
Good.
Yeah, right.
Which is where you were going with that.
Yeah,
I thought.
absolutely.
People in Siberia don't feel global warming at all.
I was
Because
interested.
they have severe winters now,
They have,
up to minus 40 and minus 60.
well, if you watch where that is, and then you watch Fairbanks, Alaska, and Nome, and keep going, they have some real severe winters.
Yeah, it doesn't smell like warming at all.
I would tell you probably 10 days ago, maybe 2 weeks, Fairbanks at night was 40 below, and the warmth of the day was 10 below.
Yeah.
We don't know what it is to have winter.
Oh, it was 88.
Yeah.
It was 88 below in Siberia last week.
It was what?
Yeah.
88 below in
Yeah,
Siberia
it was.
last week.
Well, look at the parallels. Look where Siberia is, and look where Alaska is, and the Aleutian Islands. It's really.
Yeah. I think
Norm, don't go there. Alaska did belong to Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't go there.
Very well. So did the Aleutian Islands.
Yeah. It's interesting
That was a
that
whale of a deal.
this
Just like
partic-
Louisiana Purchase.
this particular week, I thought was very humorous that all the great globalist leaders met in Davos, Switzerland, to talk about global warming, and they couldn't keep their rear ends warm enough because it was so darn cold in Davos. All right, one last thing before we quit. There's a reference here to the Book of Jasher.
Yes.
Does anyone know what the Book of Jasher is?
We heard it.
I was going to ask you that.
This is a couple chapters from the Book of Jasher. The Book of Jasher is a Jewish poetic writing that we have. The Book of Jasher, we have pretty much the whole book. It's a couple thousand years old, and it's basically poetic literature that has to do with historical events, and it's about wars that Israel was a part of. Okay, it talks about the wars. We not only have a citation here about it, but we also have a citation, if you're interested, that you can find listed in 2 Samuel 1, verses 18 through 27. It quotes a section from the Book of Jasher.
Book of Jasher, это книга праведного.
Okay.
Where do you have that listed on here? I know it's on here.
Which one?
Jasher. Where is it listed?
Under E.
Under E.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's also, interestingly enough, and this is the one I'd like to read, there's also a reference in the Bible to the book of Wars of the Lord. Now that would be interesting, except we don't have it. We have a reference to it in the Old Testament, but we don't physically have the document anymore. So that'd be an interesting read.
Do they have it over in Israel?
Not the Wars of the Lord. They don't. They have Jasher. Yeah, I mean Jasher's on the internet. It's been translated. You can get it.
Who believes everything that's on the internet?
Okay.
So it's a poetic book
About war,
about war.
battles.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, let's finish tonight.
Battles of the Jews.
Battles of the Jews. Yes.
Oh, the bet.
Yes.
The bet.
I'm going to finish tonight.
The lobby.
Turn to Psalm 44.
Golly, wow.
Somebody's finishing up here.
Psalm 44. And I want to read this to close tonight. I think it's a very beautiful psalm, and I think it goes well with what we talked about. Starting verse 1. O God, we've heard with our ears, and our fathers have told us, the work that thou didst in their days, in the days of old. Thou with thine own hand did drive out the nations. Then thou didst plant them. Thou didst afflict the peoples. Then thou didst spread them abroad. For by their own sword they did not possess the land, nor their own arm did they save them. But thy right hand and thine arm in the light of thy presence, for thou didst favor them. Thou art my king, O God. Command victories for Jacob. Through thee we will push back our adversaries. Through thy name we will trample down those who rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, nor will my sword save me. But thou hast saved us from our adversaries, and thou hast put to shame those who hate us. In God we have boasted all day long, and we will give thanks to thy name forever. And I think that was true of Israel back then, and I think it's true of Israel today. Amen. Okay, so get ready for next week in the science section.
Yeah, that's going to be one.
Don't talk too fast. I'm going to do. Don't get scientific. Don't start working on a lot of.
Don't do this. Don't do this.
Norman? You listen.
Really like that.
Okay.